Hello, everyone, and welcome to our week on Art of the Islamic World. So, this week I want us to begin to examine the origins and the roots of the Islamic faith that become manifest in art and architecture. And we're going to understand the Near Eastern artistic traditions that shaped the original forms of the art of Islam. And then I want us to begin to understand and cite various architectural developments and the terminology here. What's the terminology of Islamic religious, funerary, other structures? So, kind of begin to make some of these associations. And then begin to examine the media and the designs that are specific to the art of Islam, particularly in the luxury arts, those arts that we've been talking about off and on throughout the semester. So, to kind of get started, I want to give us a little bit of a primer in case we're not too familiar here. And to show us, I want to first look at this map. This is the Islamic world in the 15th century. Okay, so take a look, and I'm going to give us some cities that I want us to pay attention to over the course of this lecture so you just can kind of have an idea of where they are geographically. So, first, Mecca. We have Mecca, which is here in the center in Saudi Arabia, Medina, which is slightly north, Samarra, which is in modern day Iraq, Jerusalem, Damascus, Kairouan, Isfahan, and Cairo. So I realize these cities may not mean a ton to you now unless you've already done the reading, in which case, well done you. But just to have these cities in the back of your mind, because we're going to be talking about developments in each of these places over the course of this week. So this can kind of help you to be able to picture, one, how spread out the Islamic world was. I mean, notice that it's spread from Western Africa to the Indian Peninsula. And notice also that Spain was a part of the Islamic territories in the medieval times until the 15th century. That's one of the reasons, 1492, think about Columbus, but also that was a very pivotal year for Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella pushed the Moors out of Spain. So that's something else to think about. Moors are Islamic people. So this is all part of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to chart the growth of Islam. And so if we're talking about Islamic art, this is the art that is related to the religion and the culture of Islam and the Islamic Middle East. Islam's origins date back to the 7th century AD, when the Muslim prophet Muhammad from Mecca, see that there, convinced these polytheistic Arab tribes called the Bedouins to embrace his new monotheistic religion and the belief in Allah. So he convinced a group of polytheistic or multi-god believing people to become monotheistic and partake in his religion and his belief in Allah. So if we're talking about Islamic art, it doesn't only refer to specifically religious art, but also includes secular art. It's basically an art that is related to all of these territories associated with Islam, where the majority of the people are Muslim. So consequently, Islamic art can also be made for Christian and Jews living in the Middle East, and some Islamic objects are also made for the Muslim communities by Christian and Jews. So it's all part of this kind of geographical location and may or may not have to do directly with religion, but we'll kind of dive into that a little bit more. So if we're talking about what Islamic art is, there were Western scholars, so we've talked kind of about problems of terminology and thinking about the Middle East. The term Middle East is problematic because it, assumes that we're talking about a Western perspective, if you think about it like that. But Western scholars, European, mostly white scholars, coined the name Islamic for this kind of artistic production. But artists from the Middle East didn't necessarily call themselves Islamic, but necessarily Syrian, Arab, Turkish, etc. So again, their production can also include secular works, not only the religious ones. So I think that's important to say from the outset. There is a great diversity of culture, languages, geographies, histories, etc. in Islam. And so I think it's important that we take note of this, right? Studying Islamic art and architecture can put you into contact with as many as 60 languages or more. The current population of Muslim people in the world reaches nearly 1.8 billion people. That's almost 1/4 of the entire population of the world. So if we're thinking about Islam, similar to Christianity, had an important influence and has had an important influence on the production of art and architecture. And Islamic art and architecture didn't arise as something totally new in the 7th century AD. So during this lesson, I want to think about what had influenced this kind of art and architecture that we're going to look at. So in particular, I want to think about how Islamic art and architecture appropriated some of the existing artistic forms, especially those of the Byzantine Empire. If you look at this map, by the 15th century, where is Byzantium? Where is Constantinople? It's in the Islamic world, right? So we're going to see how these people appropriated some of the pre-existing artistic forms and began to incorporate them into their own unique artistic production. So briefly, if we're thinking about important facts of Islam, I'll go ahead and scoot to this slide. You may have heard of the 5 pillars of Islam. I'm just going to give you a brief history. So Islam arose on the territories of Arabia located at kind of what was the periphery of great cultural centers. If you're looking here, it was kind of on the edge of where a lot of other things were happening. So in 570 AD, Muhammad was born in Mecca, and during this time, the Arabian Peninsula was kind of peripheral or outside of the Byzantine Empire, which we have talked about, and then the Sasanian Empire that occupied the territories on the east, like modern Iran. The Middle East was important for many reasons, but especially for trade of textiles and spices, and most Arab people at this time were merchants. The nomadic Bedouin Arabs who lived on the Arabian Peninsula were not unified politically. So that's important to note, right? There are these nomadic tribes who don't really have an affiliation at this point, and this is going to bring them together. So in the early 7th century, Muhammad received revelations from God and preaches monotheism among all of these nomadic tribes. And he uses religion to unite these various nomadic tribes. So that's huge, right? Islamic is an Arabic word meaning submission to one God, or Allah in Arabic. And so by doing that, he unifies the people. So Muhammad became both a religious leader and a military leader. Okay, so that's really key. And by 622 AD, because of the opposition to his teachings, Muhammad was forced to leave Mecca for Medina. But then in 630, Muhammad returns triumphantly to Mecca and 2 years later dies in the city without indicating any successor or new leader of the Muslim community. And that's going to be also a really important thing to note, right? So if we're looking here, I want to just give a brief introduction to the 5 pillars of Islam. I'm not going to talk about them in depth, but basically, if you are a practicing Muslim, these are the 5 things that you're wanting to do over the course of your life to be a good Muslim, right? You're going to declare your faith, you're going to participate in obligatory prayer, you're going to give alms, give to charity, etc. You're going to fast in the month of Ramadan, and then you're going to make a pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, remember Mecca, here on this map, this is the birthplace and the eventual death place of Muhammad. And this is an important place to travel to because of that, but also because of the Kaaba. This is the kind of symbolic heart of Islam, right? Muhammad embraced the Kaaba, which means the cube from Arabic language, and today this Kaaba is located in the sacred mosque in Mecca. And this was originally a shrine, so this predates Islam, right? This Kaaba was originally a shrine associated with the prophet Abraham. And if you know your kind of initial world religions, Abraham is the common ancestor to Christians, Jews, and Muslims. So during the time before the birth of Islam, the Kaaba protects a sacred rock that Abraham had received from the angel Gabriel, and it had become a polytheistic shrine. This is all kind of according to legend. And so today this Kaaba is a focal point of the pilgrimage to Mecca, which is, again, one of the 5 pillars or main tenets of Islam. And so people go, they make these lifetime trips, once-in-a-lifetime trips, right, to Mecca, and they participate in this really moving kind of prayer circulation around the Kaaba to eventually try to touch it, kiss it, etc. So just note that this is the kind of central pillar, and begin as we're looking here at this image to start thinking about what are some kind of aesthetic hallmarks that you note. Colors, shapes, patterns, figures or lack thereof. These are some of the major hallmarks of Islamic art that we're going to be talking about over the course of the day. So this monument is covered in granite masonry, then covered on top of that with a silk curtain and calligraphy in gold and silver wrapped thread. And it's been redone and renovated many times over the course of history, but this is kind of the central pillar here. So, stepping back in time, you can see how Islam spread. So in the century after Muhammad's death, Muhammad died in 632 AD. In the next century after his death, Islam spread out both towards west and east, as you see here on this map. And this expansion was led by Islamic caliphs. And caliphs are governors, religious, and civil rulers in Islam. So caliph is going to be a very important term for us. So by 650, Islam is in what is now modern Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. By 750, Islam is all over northern Africa. By 710, excuse me. By 710, Islam is all over northern Africa. By 711, the next year, Islam is in northern Spain. And by 712, Islam reaches the Indus River. So you can see how quickly it's spreading rapidly across multiple continents at this point. Now, obviously, the kind of main holy book of Islam is the Quran. You can spell it either way, I'm not too picky here. But the Quran is the name given to the sacred book of Islam, and it was codified by the Muslim ruler Uthman in 644 to 656, about that time. But basically, the Quran records Muhammad's revelations that he received from God through the Archangel Gabriel. So the Quran and sacred words have a very important impact on the production of art in Islamic culture. And you have inscriptions and passages from this sacred book that are written on the walls of buildings, on luxury objects, and even on textiles, okay? And we often associate this term aniconism, A-N-I-C-O-N-I-S-M, aniconism, with Islamic art, as we link iconoclasm or iconophilia. These are a lot of terms here, but if we're thinking about icons, right? Icons are images. Aniconism is related to the belief that it's inappropriate to represent figures such as people and animals for religious reasons. There's no prohibition in the Quran that mentions this, but it becomes customary over the passage of time to not represent figures in religious art of Islam. So in mosques, manuscripts that are religious texts, etc. But you do see figures that are represented often in the secular arts of the Middle East. So begin to note this. We have a religious text that's behind the Quran. I have this floating image of the Quran on top, right? But you have this religious manuscript on the bottom right, and you have this building that we're going to talk about in just a second on the top left. And notice that there aren't people, there aren't animals that are represented in the designs, right? So we begin to see these kind of abstract organic motifs, and I want us to pay attention to that as we move forward. Now, I'm not going to really dig into this at all, but I think it's important that you can get online, make a quick search, and be able to explain what the ideological differences are between Sunni and Shia Muslims, and make a note here of, where those different tribes are, or different sects of belief are, okay? So let's start with what may be the most famous, or maybe most important to the Islamic faith, building, and that is the Dome of the Rock. And essentially this is a sanctuary or a safe place that was built to accommodate the rock, and we're going to talk about what that means here in a second. But first I want you to go online. I'm going to put this link up on Blackboard, but take a walking towards a very good virtual digital tour that you can explore the structure around, on the outside, and the interior as well of the Dome of the Rock. So take a note here. Note also that it's in Jerusalem, and so this is in a very complex, contested religious space, Jews, Christians, Muslims, all coming together in this one little geographic location, right? So this is the very first important monument dedicated to the new religion of Islam, and this is the Dome of the Rock. It's built in Jerusalem in the late 17th century, only a few decades after the death of Muhammad. The building was completed in 691-692 by the Caliph Abd al-Malik. So while he's not the official architect here, I'm giving you his name. He's the Caliph. Remember, that's the both kind of governmental, political, and religious ruler of the time. So what's interesting about this building is that if you look at it, you might think that it is a place of worship, but this is not a mosque, and a mosque is the place of worship in Islam in its strictest sense, but it's more a sanctuary or a safe space that shows the dominance of Islam. That's what it was built for, to show the dominance of Islam, and it holds this very famous rock from which Muhammad ascended to heaven. And so that's what you see here on the interior, right? So the rock lies in the center of this very circular building, gives the name to the whole structure, the Dome of the Rock. The Caliph Abd al-Malik, who sponsored the building, chose this site strategically because this was also a really important place for the Jewish community. The Jewish community believed that this was the place where Abraham was about to sacrifice his son, Isaac. And for Christians, Jerusalem, as I said, is also important, as many events in the life of Christ happened here, as well as because Christians believe in the Old Testament, which is where the story of Abraham takes place as well. So here I'm just going to give you a couple of images of the Dome of the Rock. Begin to pay attention to the decor, right? I talked about this aniconism, this lack of any figural representation. And so here you can see that there are organic forms. You're going to be able to pick some things out, but you're not going to see human beings. And that's because this is a very strictly religious space, right? So here you can see the dome, or the rock from above, from the dome. So this is where Muhammad supposedly ascended to heaven. You can see that here, and notice that it's kind of walled off so that you can see it, but you're not supposed to step on it yourself. But the golden dome of the Dome of the Rock is located directly above the central area of the building and the sacred rock itself. It's decorated with mosaics, with calligraphy. The art of hand lettering is what calligraphy is, if you didn't know that. We're going to hear more about this later. But this is supposed to symbolize the heavenly sphere, right? And the sacred, but also kind of paradisical world. And think about this. This could be something that they may have picked up or appropriated from other cultures, this idea that gold and domes can be symbolic, right? Symbolic of the spiritual world or the heavenly realm. So we'll kind of get into that as we move forward. But if you're looking at this, note the rich ornamentation, note the rich carpeting on the floor, note the really intricate use of stonework here as well. As we move in, it's really important to understand the plan of the building, which used the form of an octagon, but it also represents a centrally planned building. So you can see here that the sacred rock is in the middle, underneath the wooden dome that's covered with gold. And then you have the two rings of octagons, inner and outer, that are called ambulatories, so not that different, right, from what we've seen in a centrally planned Christian church as far as terminology is concerned. The ambulatory places you walk around, right? You ambulate. And these indicate these circular corridors where the Muslim believers would circumambulate or walk around the rock. The entrance, there are 4 entrances to the building, and they're each located at a cardinal direction. So they're north, south, east, and west. And then you have very large piers and columns that support the structure, and you can see those in those big dark spots on the footprint, right? So if you see this earlier architectural vocabulary, you have an octagon shape, you have ambulatories or these circular aisles, piers, columns, even domes. You know, we've seen this in the plan of the Christian Church of San Vitale in Ravenna that was built more than a century earlier by Justinian. And similar to Justinian, the Byzantine Empire, who by building this church wanted to assert his power over the western part of the Byzantine Empire, The Muslim caliph wanted to build the Dome of the Rock to assert the power of Islam over Christianity. And he borrowed the architectural vocabulary of Byzantine Christian culture to help him with this project. So similar to the Christians, and this is not, this is not something that's totally new, because the Christians appropriated certain features of the ancient Roman architectural vocabulary for their needs. Think about Roman basilicas that became places of worship among Christians. And the Muslim builders appropriated certain features of the Christian architecture for their own needs. Ambulatories, for instance, they fulfill this need to pay respect to the sacred rock by allowing the believers to walk around it. But notice here the major differences between the two structures. The number of entrances is different, and the Islamic building's central point is the rock, even though it's inaccessible to the worshippers who can only walk around it. In the case of San Vitale, the focal point is the apse with the mosaics and the altar. So note those differences here. We also, again, this is a kind of bigger image of a slide I showed you earlier, this luxurious decoration, the great numbers of golden mosaics. This was also inspired by Byzantine art. So if we're looking at these mosaics, just to give you a couple of examples here, I want to kind of compare briefly San Vitale with the Dome of the Rock. If you're comparing these, what's the big difference? What's the main difference between these mosaics? Hopefully you can see that the Byzantine mosaics from San Vitale featured figures, human beings, right? And important iconography related to religious teachings. The Islamic mosaics from the Dome of the Rock, on the other hand, show abstract, vegetal, geometric motifs instead of figures, and this is again because they're located in the religious building and follow the principles of aniconism. These mosaics represent this vision of paradise beyond our world now. The Islamic mosques, if you note here along the top of the Islamic mosaic here on the bottom right, the Islamic mosaics also feature calligraphy, the art of hand lettering, which features important passages related to the Quran. Some details of these mosaics of the interior of the Dome of the Rock feature these motifs that were appropriated from Sasanian culture. This Sasanian culture was associated with the Persian Empire between the 3rd and 7th centuries AD. So they're again bringing in these different cultures, asserting their dominance here. And so the motifs of the Sasanian culture are the jeweled crowns that you see here, which resemble the crowns of the Sasanian kings and were seen on metal coins from the time. So I want to give you a quick quotation, and here at the bottom I've given you the kind of source here, but there was a very famous medieval traveler named Ibn Battuta who described the Dome of the Rock back in his book in the 14th century, and he's talking about Jerusalem and its holy sites. And here he says, "The Dome of the Rock is a building of extraordinary beauty, solidity, elegance, and singularity of shape. It stands on an elevation in the center of the mosque and is reached by a flight of marble steps. It has 4 doors. The space round it is also paved with marble, excellently done, and the interior likewise. Both outside and inside, the decoration is so magnificent and the workmanship so surpassing as to defy description. The greater part is covered with gold, so that the eyes of one who gazes on its beauties are dazzled by its brilliance, now glowing like a mass of light, now flashing like lightning. In the center of the dome is a blessed rock from which the prophet ascended to heaven, a great rock projecting about a man's height, and underneath it there is a cave the size of a small room, also of a man's height, with steps leading down to it." So take that quote, you can pause, re-listen to it if you need to, but we might return to it later on, right? Another important early architectural building of Islam, and this is a mosque in its strictest sense, is the Mosque of Damascus, modern Syria, that was built in the early 8th century. So the Mosque of Damascus is a good one to kind of start with as an official mosque because it has many features that are common for mosque architecture. This architecture follows the plan of the house of the Prophet Muhammad in Medina. And so let's look at this image. The Prophet Muhammad's house in Medina had a central courtyard and a covered side with a flat roof supported by columns. Hopefully you can see here this a hippo-style hall, right? We've seen this before. And this hall was used as a prayer hall. So this type of mosque with a courtyard and a hippo-style prayer hall supported by columns is called the hippo-style mosque. Another important fact to remember is the significance of the Qibla wall. This is the wall of the building that indicates the direction of prayer and is oriented towards Mecca. So you're always going to be praying towards Mecca if you're Muslim. And so the Qibla wall is going to direct you as far as which direction you need to turn. And so it's usually located at the very end of the prayer area. And here you can see it in the plan of the Great Mosque. Now, if we're looking at the Mosque of Damascus, actually, let's go back to this photograph. If we're looking at the Mosque of Damascus, we can locate the central courtyard. We can also locate the prayer or the hippo-style hall. Also, I want us to pay attention here to another important element, the minaret. Now, here there are 3 of them, and these are these towers, right? You see the towers, 1 in the center, 2 on the corners there. These indicate the tower structure from which they call the believers to prayer. They call them to come pray. So note here, we can see the courtyard, the minarets, and the prayer hall. So if we're going back to the plan, here you see it. The hippo-style or the prayer hall in the Mosque of Damascus has 3 different aisles, or they call them naves. So it's again borrowing this kind of terminology. But the wall that kind of delineates the edge of the building from the outside is the Qibla wall, and this indicates the direction of prayer towards Mecca. And so here you can see this is actually what the interior of the prayer hall of the Great Mosque of Damascus looks like. You can see here the view of the aisles that face the Qibla wall on the left, and the rows of very tall columns separate the aisles. Notice here again we have these very lush carpets. We can't really see them, but you get an idea of them, right? But the use of color is very important, the rich ornamentation, all of that is going to be very, very important. The walls of the Damascus Mosque were also decorated with these very luxurious mosaics. So the theme, again, is referring to paradise, and here we can see all these different architectural palaces, abundant vegetation, and water. And think about this as being really important. These last 2 elements, vegetation and water, were really valued because of the dry climate and the scarcity of water in this region. So that's, again, kind of talking about what paradise is going to look like, and we can see that manifest in their mosaics. And again, here, most of the mosaics use golden background, similar to Byzantine mosaics. I want to also just have us be aware that, unfortunately, we know that there's a lot going on in the Middle East right now, has been for a while, and unfortunately, due to military conflicts, a lot of really important Islamic buildings have been destroyed in the past few years, like this really important Grand Mosque of Aleppo in Syria. And so here you can see some kind of before and after pictures of how grand it was and how it's been destroyed by bombings. So here I just want you to practice by yourself. This is in Tunisia, in Kairouan, and this is the Great Mosque, right? And so read the passages in your textbook and be able to kind of pick out, describe the plan of the building project of the Mosque of Kairouan, and begin to notice again where the most important components of the plan are. And those components are the courtyard, the minaret, the hippo-style hall, and the Qibla wall. So begin to start picking those out, begin to understand where they are located in the plan, and also how you might be able to figure out where they are if you're looking at an aerial shot as well. So we've talked about minarets, and here you can see the minaret of the Great Mosque in Samarra. The minarets can have different layouts, they can have different forms, and maybe the most outstanding of all of them is the one that is here called the Malwiya, the spiral minaret. So Malwiya means spiral, right? And that's very obvious why it has that name. So look at this and think about how you would describe this particular minaret. And think about maybe where its inspiration might have come from. Because of its location in modern Iraq, This corresponds to ancient Sumer and Mesopotamia. There is a theory that the minaret of Samarra was inspired by earlier Mesopotamian structures made of mud brick that we've already talked about, right? The ziggurats, like you see here, this reconstruction on the right. Both structures are composed of multiple levels with a kind of central high place that is the high holy place. So here now I want to transition and talk just briefly about the mausoleum of the Samanids in Uzbekistan. This is in Bukhara. So read the passages about this building in your textbook and be able, by the time you've read it, to answer these questions for yourself. So think about where this building is located, who built it, and what purpose was it built for. What are the construction materials? What is it made of, right? And then briefly describe the form and the outside or the exterior decoration of this structure. So from there, we're going to move on. We're going to look at another mosque. And this is a different kind of mosque. This is the Four Ivan Mosque, the Friday Mosque of Isfahan in Iran. So even though the Hypostyle Mosque was the first type of the mosque and remains the most common type of mosque, in the 11th century, a local dynasty of people in modern Iran developed this other kind of mosque architecture, which we call the Four Ivan Mosque, or that we see here in this example of the Friday Mosque of Isfahan here. This type of mosque is also built around a courtyard. However, at each side of the courtyard, the builders erected a large vaulted entrance called the Ivan. You see them here, right? The Ivans lead the visitors to different parts of the mosque, and the largest one that you see here in the back that's topped by a dome indicates the location of the main prayer hall and the Qibla wall. So this should help you be able to kind of figure out where you're located within the mosque and understand which direction you need to head to be able to pray, right? So in contrast to the Damascus mosque that had been made out of stone, which is very accessible in Syria, the Isfahan mosque was made out of baked brick, which was characteristic for this region in Iran. Some parts of the mosque were embellished with colored tiles, which became this feature of Islamic architectural decoration from about the 12th, 13th century. And you can see tile decoration again in a second. But notice here the major parts and how this is different from the Hypostyle Hall or the Hypostyle Mosque. Compare that with the Friday Mosque that we have here. I want to call attention to the mihrab. The mihrab is another characteristic feature of the mosque architecture, and this is the niche that is located in the Qibla wall. So you see the Qibla wall here. The mihrab is the center of attention of the Muslim prayer as it shows this proper direction of the prayer, and it's also this kind of focal point similar to an altar in a Christian church. And so because of that, the mihrab will become one of the most decorated elements of the mosque and will often feature really beautiful tile mosaics like you have on the left, or these carved reliefs on the right with very ornamental, vegetal, or abstract motifs, and with calligraphic inscriptions referring to the words of Allah. So I hope you can see both of those things here. Also take a note that this mihrab that's on the left, this is a reproduction that is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And if you have time ever and you're in the Met, make sure you go see the Islamic Art Wing. It's really beautiful, and they've done a very good job of recreating these historic spaces. So now I want to shift and talk about luxury arts. We've talked about luxury arts before in different kind of contexts, and medieval Islamic craftsmen produced a great number of luxury artworks. And this is perhaps because other forms of art, like oil paintings, weren't really popular in this region. So here I want you to look at this, look at the detail first and foremost. And this is ivory. So think about what this would have taken to be able to create this, right? But read the passages in your textbook related to this particular work and answer the following questions. What is a pyxis? Where was the object produced and for what occasion? What is represented and written on here? And then think about this. I think this is a really kind of interesting question. If we are working under this aniconism, right? Is it appropriate to decorate an object like this with figural decoration? So think about that. Justify your answer. Be able to justify why you think that. Similarly, we have metalwork, and some of the metalwork of this era and this region is striking. And so think about what this is. This ewer in the form of a bird, and notice that we have an actual name associated with this. So I want you to read the passage on the book on this, understand what its function is, and then what does this object represent and what are the different elements on it? And would this be appropriate to use this object in a mosque? So kind of related to the last question, but thinking about that here. Now, we talked about the people in the Islamic world being people that were associated with trade. And I think this is a great example of that, and I want to just take a minute to look at it. So this is a basin, and this particular basin is now located in the Louvre in Paris. And this is actually from the royal family of France, and it was this treasured object that was used to baptize the children of the royal family of France for centuries, but it's not actually a French object originally. It comes from the area of kind of Egypt and Syria and dates from the kind of beginning part of the 14th century. And it was created by this group of, or it comes from this culture of artisans called Mamluk, Mamluk. And the Mamluks had been slave warriors, and they asserted their independence, and they became rulers in countries that are today Egypt and Syria for several hundred years. And during this period that they're becoming rulers and they asserted their own autonomy, they became known as extraordinary craftsmen. They were known especially for their textile work and their metal work, and this is a really good example of that, obviously. Now, if this is a work of art made specifically for an Islamic purpose, right, we'd probably see large bands of calligraphy, but this one doesn't have that. The only part that isn't completely covered in imagery are the bottom few inches on the inside of the basin, which you can't really see here, but even the base or the floor of the basin is completely covered. So if you look here, we have these different friezes or registers of animals and men. And it's what I think is really interesting is that art historians still have really not unpacked the meaning here. But if you look, we have these figures that are on horseback and figures that are standing and holding goblets, and they're clearly rulers or important people. And then you have the figures in between that seem to be either hunters or in scenes of battles. There are, if you look closely, maybe not in this particular image, but there are, also limbs and decapitated heads, so there's violence here. But we don't really understand what this is made for. But I think what's interesting here and why we're looking at this is that there is a definite note of kind of cross-cultural reference here. We don't know on the inside, actually on the bottom band in some of these roundels, you can see these bronze circles on the bottom. You can see that there is actually a fleur-de-lis in there. And the fleur-de-lis is the symbol of the royal family of France, but interestingly, it's also associated with Mamluk sultans. And so you're not sure whether they were made for France or remade when they came, reworked when they came to France. We're not sure. But what's interesting again is that we don't really understand what this was made for. We don't understand if it was actually a commissioned work by the French from these Mamluk people, or if they made this object and then kind of reworked it for the French. There are a lot of different interpretations of what is actually happening here. But I think if we're talking about how people are kind of learning from each other, borrowing from each other, appropriating different elements of culture, that's really key here for this particular image. So again, just take some time and look at this and begin to think about how these cultures might have drawn from one another and think about what this object was used for and begin to kind of pull meaning from that. Okay, so now we've talked about calligraphy. We've talked about aniconism. We have figures represented here. Let's talk a little bit more about calligraphy just briefly. So as we talked about earlier, the art of hand lettering or calligraphy is really, really important in Islam due to the importance given to the Quran and the representation of sacred text. So what you have here, beginning with the rise of Islam, is the name of famous calligraphers that began to spread out across the Islamic world. And the earliest Qurans date back to the 9th or 10th century, including this one, which is made in ink and gold on vellum. So we've talked a little bit about the different manuscript materials. That's going to be working here as well. So this text is written in Kufic script. This is an early script known for its legibility and its angular characters, and we can also see it on the walls of the Islamic buildings. And this is called the Cave, Al-Kaf. This is a Quran page with the beginning of Surah 18, just if you're curious. But so look at what you notice here. What do you see figures? Do you see what kind of representations? So the Islamic calligraphers use ornamental features like the golden leaf border that goes across the top. And this border marks the title of the chapter of the Quran and distinguishes the title from the words of Allah, which are written in black ink here. And notice that Arabic script is read from right to left, so that's the direction that you're going to be reading this. And just to show you another example, again, due to aniconism, Islamic religious illuminated manuscripts often utilize geometric or vegetal imagery rather than figural imagery. But notice the color, the use of vibrant colors here, and the use of pattern. This is a very rich text, right? This illumination, this decorated manuscript is a feast for the eyes, so it marks the kind of sacred quality of how important this text was. So this manuscript is written on paper with elegant scripting of these very complex patterns, vibrant colors that show design motifs that are also seen on Islamic architectural decorations and carpets. So you're going to be able to kind of see that there are themes, motifs that we're going to see over and over again in the Islamic world. On the other hand, though, illuminated manuscripts that are made for secular purposes, maybe to celebrate the accomplishments of the caliph or the ruler, these manuscripts often feature prominently figural representations like we have here in this Mughal manuscript from the 17th century. So the Mughal emperors, that's Mughal, were associated with the territory of what is now India today. And in Mughal manuscripts, birds, animals, plants, architecture native to the region, all of these things are often incorporated in their manuscripts. So begin to look here. I realize that most of us probably don't know the language. We may not be able to read the text here, but look at this image. And if I told you that this is going to be a secular manuscript, try and figure out if you can, see what's happening here. See what would be the narrative if you had to construct one. And notice this is made, or perhaps documenting the emperor or Mughal emperor Shah Jahan. This guy is a really important figure for us. And he's important for a number of reasons, but he was a very big patron of the arts, and in fact is responsible for what may be India's most famous building, the Taj Mahal. So if you're looking at the Taj Mahal, you see how important it is, how ornate it is, how large it is, you're probably thinking this is an immense place of worship, right? Not quite. This is a very poignant story. So Shah Jahan was the 5th ruler of the Mughal dynasty, and during his 3rd year while he was reigning, his favorite wife, that was known as Mahal, or Mumtaz Mahal, she died due to complications that arose from the birth of their 14th child. And I have to sit with that for a second. 14 children, complications, that's rough. But so the emperor was distraught. He was deeply saddened, and so from the death of his wife, he began planning this construction of a suitable permanent resting place for his beloved wife. And so the result of all of these efforts and his immense resources, he had a lot of wealth, was the creation here that the world knows today as the Taj Mahal. So remember, Mahal reflects back to her her original name, and this is also essentially a mausoleum, right? So in general terms, Sunni Muslims prefer a simple burial under open sky, but it's pretty regular for important Mughals and rulers to make these domed mausolea being the plural of a mausoleum. So begin to think back to the other mausoleum that we've already looked at, right, and that hopefully you've read about in your text. So that this isn't unique, this structure isn't unique as far as being a burial place for a ruler, but it is unique as far as how big it is, its scale, how monumental. The gardens or the lavish ornamentation and the overt use of white marble. So the Taj Mahal is built in Agra, which is in kind of northern India, and this is built where Shah Jahan first took the throne in 1628. It had been conquered by Muslim invaders in the 11th century, and so that's centuries before this, and at this point the city had transformed into this flourishing area of trade during his rule. And it was situated on the banks of a river, and so it was known as this kind of riverfront garden paradise city. And it had these meticulously planned gardens, all these flowering bushes and fruit trees, etc. So it was a very wealthy place. It was known as kind of a paradise on earth, and that is exactly what Shah Jahan was trying to plan with this compound structure. So if you note here, we have the kind of overall plan, and that you enter from this gate, right? You walk through the forecourt. You can look here, that's number 7. Then you walk through the main gate, number 6, and then you're put into these gardens with the ornamental pool that leads your eye directly to the actual tomb. On either side of the structure, you have, you can't see them here really, but you can note their positions in the top left and right corners on the plan. You have these identical buildings in red sandstone. One of these is a mosque, and the other one we are calling a guest house, although we're not entirely sure what it was made for, but essentially it gives us architectural balance and symmetry, which is really important. And so we have this bulbous dome. Note this here. If you look, you can see it in the image, but you can also definitely see it in the plans that you have here in the bottom, that it's not entirely round, right? You have this kind of interesting bulbous shape to it. And this is becoming quickly a hallmark of Islamic architecture. You also have 4 minarets, so we've looked at those before. Hopefully you're able to pick those out. Now they're normally associated with mosques for calling believers to prayer, but here they're not functional. Instead, they're ornamental. Again, kind of underscoring this focus on structural balance and harmony that are key to the Mughal Empire. And I want you to take a note here briefly with this inlaid stone. And if you look at this, you can't really tell the intricacy from this image on the outside, but when you get close to the Taj Mahal, you can see the mosaics that are all made with precious stones and marble to give including coral, onyx, carnelian, amethyst, lapis lazuli, all of these stones and precious minerals that are really expensive. They add to the kind of splendor of the overall white exterior. And so you have this very kind of floral imagery. Some of the things you can recognize, even some of these species of flowers, botanists have been able to pick out what they are, but some of them we don't really know. And so some scholars think they might be kind of fanciful species of flowers, another kind of paradise afterlife kind of theme here. But you can see that here. And an interesting thing to note is that these designs were made by craftsmen whose families, the original, I think, 300 craftsmen, still work in India today, and they still create these beautiful inlaid stone pieces within the white marble that you can see here. So once you step inside, you're confronted more with the overall purpose of the Taj Mahal as a mausoleum, right? That you have these ornate tombs or marble cenotaphs on raised platforms. So eventually you have the emperor's cenotaph laid down beside his wife's after he died 3 decades later, And both of these are encased in an octagon of these very ornate, very detailed, carved marble screens that you can see around. So the coffins bearing their remains lie in the spaces directly beneath the cenotaphs. So I'd like for you to read the part in your textbook about the Taj Mahal and think briefly about why this building has become so famous, why it has become one of these kind of wonders of the contemporary world, and what this building represents. What is the meaning behind it, and why do you think it persists as being this kind of landmark in India? So finally, I just wanted to show you briefly another area of luxury arts that we haven't talked about that's in detail, but that's very, very important to the Islamic world. Everybody's heard about quote unquote Oriental carpets. Islamic carpets have adorned private homes, palaces, and mosques for centuries, and they've also been traded throughout the Western world as luxury items. So I want you to read in your textbook the passages related to the Ardabil carpet that you see here and be able to answer the kind of following questions. Where was it found? What's so special about this carpet? And then begin to be able to describe the main decorative elements or designs that you see here on this carpet. So some reading in your text this week. Hopefully these can tie together some of these major themes that we've been talking about. And as always, let me know if you have any questions. I hope you guys are having a good week.